Apparently, having a pet can help cultivate one's gut. I'm gonna read that again. Hello and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today's video is an isolated review of the Disabled Tyrant's Beloved Pet Fish. That title is very long and I wasn't sure I was going to get it right without looking at the book itself, but I believe that I did. I posted about this one right after I finished reading it on Instagram, and I'd asked people how they were choosing to abbreviate it because the title is pretty long, and someone had mentioned that when they read the fan translation, the title on that translation was Pet Pound Fish, or maybe it was Pound Pet Fish, one or the other. I'm going to confirm which one is the correct one, and that's how I'm going to be referring to this series going forward. Not necessarily in this video, but if I keep reading the series, that's how I'm going to be referring to it. And this is an isolated review because that's what I do for my danmei series that I'm reading. I will do an isolated review for the very first volume in the series, and then for other volumes in the series, I'm going to lump those into my danmei diaries video, where I just talk about all the danmei that I'm reading, all the danmei that I'm buying, and just danmei shit in general, like the title suggests, danmei diary. So, isolated review for the Disabled Tyrant's Beloved Pet Fish. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of backstory, maybe a bit of TMI as well about this series. This goes back to February, earlier in the year, when Barnes & Noble was doing a 25% off sale for pre-orders. I had gift cards and I was just thinking to myself, okay, I have these gift cards, I'm going to use them for something. So I decided to order some danmei novels that I wanted from 7 Seas and a bunch of manga that I was really looking forward to releases for them this year. So I started going through 7 Seas danmei release calendar for the year, and I was familiar with most of the titles there until I saw this one. The title stood out to me and I wasn't familiar with it, so that piqued my interest. I decided to click on it and read it a little bit because that title just grabs you in like, what does that even mean? I read up on it, I'm just like, seriously? A pet fish? Are you serious? Do people just not have anything to write about anymore? I was hardcore judging this series by the title and the little bit that I read about it on the website, but something in me just decided to go look up reviews about the series. Since I was already going down the calendar anyways, I didn't want to rule anyone off without giving them a fair chance. So I read up reviews on the series and the reviews were very, very good. So I reined in my judgment and I decided to pick up the first volume. I'm gonna say that that was a very good decision. I enjoyed this first volume very, very much. And now that I think about it, transmigration stories in general tend to be very, very fun reads. No matter how ridiculous the premise might be sometimes, if you just hold in your judgment and try to keep as open of a mind as possible, chances are you're going to enjoy what you're reading, and I was able to do that for this series. So I'm happy that I gave the series a chance because I really, really enjoyed reading it. Now for the rest of the review in the video, I'm going to read the synopsis on the back of the novel, talk a little bit about the illustration because I thought the illustration for this book was very, very beautifully done. Then I'll give my first impression of the series before I do a more detailed review of it. Okay, so starting with the synopsis. He's the perfect catch. When Li Yu falls asleep reading a web novel about a ruthless mute tyrant falling in love with a dainty male concubine, he doesn't expect to wake up inside the world of the novel, especially not as a fish. Li Yu soon finds himself adopted as Prince Jing's pet carp, tasked by a less than helpful magic system with preventing the prince from becoming a crow tyrant. If he can accomplish this mission, Li Yu will regain his human form, yet how can he succeed from inside a fishbowl? The fan favorite comedy danmei makes its English language debut. I'm gonna say that the last sentence or statement in that synopsis was accurate. I don't know about it being a fan favorite because I haven't done that much research about it, but if I'm going by the very good reviews that I saw about the series that convinced me to pick it up, it's probably accurate. But the fact that it's a comedy danmei series is very, very accurate for reading this first volume. It was lighthearted, comedic, and fun. So if you just keep an open mind regardless of how ridiculous the premise of the series is, I think anyone can actually enjoy reading this. And for the illustration of this first volume is so beautifully done. I think the only other illustration that I've liked as much since 7 Seas started releasing danmei will be for Thousand Autumns, which is why it is such a shame that the paper quality for this novel was so terrible and a downgrade. So if you collect all the novels all the danmei novels that Seven Seas has been releasing, you notice that along the way they stopped doing French flaps for some of them. So the French flaps are like that overlap that you see right here for series like the 𝕍𝕻𝔻𝕸𝕋 series. I believe Thousand Autumns has that as well. I'm actually blanking, I can't remember right now. I'm going to check and put a fact check on the screen when I'm editing this video, but some of them don't. Guardian, for example, doesn't have the French flaps, and this one doesn't as well, which isn't a big deal. We've already seen some of that. But what enraged fans about this volume in particular was that if you actually open the book, the paper quality is very, well, I wouldn't say it's very terrible, but it's definitely a downgrade from what they have been releasing so far. And they weren't open about that or honest about it, but fans still had to pay the same price that they paid for much better quality in the other volumes. I think if they just tried to be open about how maybe the economy has made sourcing paper terrible. I have no idea what goes on in the publishing world, but it's probably an explanation of something like that. And if they'd been more open and honest about it, sure, not everyone would be understanding, but if they had been honest about it and fans knew to expect that, then they probably wouldn't have been as angry about the quality of the paper. So I wanted to mention that, but I'm also going to show you in an overlay, I think that's what you call it, I can't remember right now, what the illustration of the novel looks like, because I just think it is so beautiful and I want to show you. So the cover, the back cover, some of the illustrations that were done inside of the book, the colored illustrations. I don't know if the colored illustrations and the black and white illustrations were done by the same person, but they're very different. Yeah, they were done by different people. So three different illustrations. It says it was illustrated by 𝕍𝕆𝔻𝕸𝕋. The bonus illustration was done by Kura. I don't know what the bonus illustration is, maybe the one to the side right here. And then the cover illustration was done by 𝕍𝕻𝔻𝕻. I'm talking about the cover illustration specifically, and unlike the first few pages of the book, that continues from the cover illustration. It is so beautiful. I love the covers, the color scheme that was used for it, the way the prince was drawn, the way the pet fish was drawn, just everything about it. It is absolutely gorgeous, which is another reason that kind of drew me to the series, although I'd already pre-ordered it. But yes, that is the synopsis and a little bit about the cover illustration. The next thing I was going to talk about was my first impression of the series. So I really enjoyed this. The plots, like I said, very, very fun. If I'm going by just a vibey rating system, I'm going to give this 5 stars because I went in with little to no expectations, and to have the book just meet expectations that I didn't even have in the first place, I have nothing to complain about. It was very enjoyable, so I'm just going to give it 5 stars. But I'm also going to do a more detailed review like I did for 𝕍𝕆𝔻𝕻𝕍's release, Case File Compendium. I started using the CAWPILE system to rate some of these books because it helps me to engage with them a little bit more critically. And the CAWPILE system was something that was invented by G from Book Roast. I'm going to put links in the description all about the CAWPILE system, how I use it, and some helpful articles that I've been using to just guide me through using the system.
What is it? It is an acronym that represents 7 different aspects of a story, and you assign numbers to each of the 7 categories in the system from 1 through 10. When you're done, you add them up and calculate the average across all 7 categories. And this is where you also want to assign what number is equivalent to each star rating. You can decide to add halves, quarters, or whatever else floats your boat.
But yes, that is the CAWPILE system. I'm going to go ahead and start talking about that, starting with C, which represents characters and credibility. For this book specifically, I'm going to be talking about characters, and I've decided to split them into 2 categories, main characters and secondary characters. For a story like this that is romantically focused, you would usually have two characters unless you have more than two people in this romantic relationship, which is not the case here. You only have two people. But because of the special circumstances in this book, I'm going to be lumping one more person in with the main characters. So your very first main character is Liu, the boy that transmigrated into the world of this novel to become the tyrant's pet fish. And then you have the tyrant himself, Prince Jing, whose name is 𝕍𝕍𝔻𝕻. And then the very last person that I'm lumping in with the main characters, because Prince Jing is mute, is the person that oftentimes serves as his mouthpiece throughout the series. And that will be the eunuch that serves him, Wang Shi. I also personally really love this character in the book, so I'm just going to talk about the three of them briefly. Firstly, you have Liu, the boy that transmigrated into the world of this novel. Now, transmigration as a whole is not like a novel plot. You see it often more recently. I don't know if it has just gained more popularity recently or if I've just started reading a lot of plots that focus on this kind of storyline more recently, but you have some commonalities in transmigration stories where you have this main character that has an omniscient point of view, and they're made aware of events that are going to occur in the world that they have been transmigrated to because they already know what's going to happen in that world, but for one reason or another, they have to prevent something from happening because it's not going to be a good thing if it happens. But where this story starts to derail from the more common plots that you see is that oftentimes, so I'm going to use CAWPILE as an example. The main character was transmigrated into the body of someone that already existed in the story that he read, and that person was going to meet a terrible fate if they didn't change the plot of the story. So that is something that they had to change. But in a story like this, for example, the pet fish did not exist in the story that Liu read. So he transmigrated into a character that didn't exist in the original story. So he's an added character in the story, but he still has to change something that happened in the story that he read. And I liked him as a character because he was pretty smart. The system in this novel was very game-based. I think a lot of them oftentimes are, where it has like quests, reward systems, and things like that. But Liu navigated the system really, really well. He thought through quests as they were given to him. He wasn't just randomly trying to figure things out. He actually put a lot of thought into them, and he was smart about the way that he used his rewards and tried to just figure out how to make sure that he passed the quest and survived, and eventually will be able to return to his world as a human being. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the novel, because even though it was meant to be a comedic novel, he still had a main character that was smartly navigating the system and the quests that were being assigned to him. So that is your main character that was transmigrated into the world of the novel. The second main character, Prince Jing, is mute, but I feel like you don't really know much about him as a character beyond how Liu feels about him, because the story focuses more on Liu, but he's also a pretty smart character, because in this first book, this is kind of a spoiler if you haven't read it, but I'm going to put a tag on the screen just so if you don't want to listen to it, you don't have to listen to this portion of the video. But he figured out in this first book that his pet fish was probably a human being, because he had run into a human being a couple of times that he wasn't very familiar with in the palace, and eventually figured out that this pet fish that he had the ability to transform. He was able to figure out that his pet fish had the ability to transform into a human being because he put some thought into the appearances or the occurrences where this human being had showed up, and the fact that there was no way where someone would have just randomly appeared from here. And through process of elimination, he realized that, okay, my pet fish was the only person that was present here when this person appeared, and he was able to figure it out. It might not be like a mind-blowing thing to some people, but if you read some novels, others probably wouldn't even put that much thought into stuff like that. So I was really impressed by the fact that both of them thought through things, and it's just going to make their relationship interesting in the future, because they are very calm and they think through things without just rushing ahead and jumping to conclusion. So for the both of them, I like that part about their characters. Now for the last character, the eunuch Wang Shi, I loved this character like I mentioned earlier. Firstly because he's kind of the prince's mouthpiece, but also because He is a character that, although the two main characters kind of have each other to weather the storm together because they're going to be love interests for each other, it's always really nice in a story like this to have another character who is going to be their ally in everything that they go through throughout the series. Especially in a story like this where you're dealing with palace politics and there's going to be a lot of backstabbing and betrayal. It's always nice to know that, okay, this person undoubtedly is going to be on the side of your main character. I liked him for that reason, and there were just some interesting things that happened in the novel, and to see the way that he reacted, even with Liu that was a pet fish and was trying to defend the prince with everything that was happening, although this wasn't something that the prince himself and the eunuch were privy to. It was just very interesting to see their dynamics all together, even though they weren't aware that they were interacting with this pet fish the way that they thought that they were. But because you could see the inner mind of the pet fish, it was just interesting to read all of their dynamics and their interactions with each other. So those are your three main characters. I'm going to count them as the three main characters. I love their characterization and I thought it was very interesting to read. Now, secondary characters that I focused on in the story, I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as possible because I think this section is starting to become very, very long. Because you have palace politics in this story, there are quite a number of characters to focus on. Secondary character wise, I'm going to start with the two that were talked about the most in the series, and I have lovingly started referring to them as the dumbass duo, and that will be the noble consort and the second prince. So because the prince in the story, Prince Jing, the tyrant, is mute, he is not in line to become the crown prince in this kingdom that they exist in. So the second prince is now the crown prince, and his mom is the noble consort. Prince Jing's mom was the empress, so she was like the main wife, and the noble consort is just like a concubine that got promoted to being a consort. So you have that very interesting dynamic between them. But when you're reading, the noble consort and her son, they still have this very ill will towards Mu Tianqi, Prince Jing, for some reason, and that just made absolutely no sense to me because you already have the title of crown prince. This person is not a threat to you, but for some reason they just wouldn't leave him alone, which is why I'm referring to them as the dumbass duo. They pulled off some really terrible harebrained schemes in this story. I think that was why it was so easy to see how smart the main characters also were in the book, because in comparison, how they thought through things and how this mother and son duo came up with the things that they came up with in the book, I'm just like, oh my god, there's no way you guys actually thought you could pull this off without someone figuring out how terribly you've tried to pull this off, and that you're obviously the ones responsible for trying to do this. They are so dumb. But I think this is another comedic aspect of the book because it tells you point blank period that they're obviously cannon fodder, and that's probably why some of the things that they did were obviously so stupid and obvious to readers that, okay, these people obviously are not meant to exist in the story for longer than necessary. I've said obviously a lot, but yes, some things that they did in the book were just so stupid. Like, thinking about them now, I'm just like, there's no way you don't know that you're just a side character, right? Because these things you're doing, it doesn't guarantee a long life for you. So those secondary characters I definitely focused on. There were other princes in the novel that are probably going to be fighting for the role of crown prince now that the second prince has fallen out of favor with the emperor in this first book, because he did some really terrible things that everyone just figured out that he was responsible for. So you have other princes in the running to become the crown prince. Those are secondary characters that I'm going to focus on in the future. And then the last secondary character is another one that is possibly going to become an ally of the main characters, and that is Prince Jing's cousin Ye Xinghuan. He comes into the story much later because there was something that happened in the novel that was going to affect him, and Liu got a side quest that had to focus on trying to save him from the fate of what happens to him in the novel, and that's how he got dragged into the main plot. So he's another secondary character that I really enjoyed reading about. Also very interesting dynamic with the prince and the pet fish. So those are the characters. I really enjoyed their characterization, and they made the book really fun to read. I'm going to give this category 8 points. The very next letter is going to be A, authenticity, art, and atmosphere. For the letter A, I'm going to focus on talking about atmosphere and authenticity. Art is mostly used for like comic books, manga, manhwa, stuff like that actually have artwork to describe the story that's being told, which although you have some illustrations in this book, it's not the main focus of the story. So I'm going to focus on talking about atmosphere and authenticity, and those two usually refer to world building. The world building in this story is not trying to be overly complicated. It's very simple, especially for such a lighthearted story as this one. And I think the only thing that started to give you a little bit of like atmosphere for the story will be the fact that it is set in an environment of a royal palace where you have people fighting to be the crown prince or the ruler in this world. And even something like that where it will be more like a dangerous environment to exist in, filled with bloodbath because you're trying to rise above all the other competitors in a situation like this. That wasn't exactly the way it came across in the book, because it is written in such a fun way that even situations that should be very, very serious end up not looking that way. And that is not a critique of the way it was written. I enjoyed it actually. It's not like they made it look like a joke. It's just, even though you realize that there is some kind of danger in this situation, it doesn't become the main focus of the situation. The main focus of the plot is still the fact that this is a transmigration story and your main character is a pet fish, if that makes sense. So I enjoyed the atmosphere and the authentic, or the author's attempt to be authentic with their world building in the story, and I give this category 9 points. The next letter, or the next category, will be W, which stands for writing. This is going to be another really short category. And writing wise, I'm not even talking about how great the plot was or the fact that it was mind-blowing or anything. That is not the point of this category. There is a plot focused category in the CAWPILE system. Writing just means how well the words in the novel flowed. I thought it was very well written. And it's not like it was so intriguing that it had me at the edge of my seat, because this is not like a thriller or anything where you're waiting to figure out who did this or what's going to happen next. But I still enjoyed it because it flowed really, really well. And it took me like 2 to 3 days of 2 to 3 hour sessions. So about 6 hours, maybe 6 or 7 hours in total to read this. It just went by really, really fast. I didn't even struggle to read it like at all. I don't know how else to describe how easy it was to read this, probably because it was just so fun to read. So I'm going to give that category 10 points. I actually have no complaints about how it was written. I thought it was very well written in that aspect. So 10 points for that category. The next category now is going to be plot. This is where we're going to talk about how well the plot was done. And again, I'll say that this is a pretty straightforward plot, which is oftentimes the case for transmigration stories like this. You know that your main character, the prince, is going to become a tyrant in the future, and that this other main character, 𝕍𝕍, becomes a pet fish to try to prevent that from happening. So that is the main goal of your story, and then there are just some things that happen along the way of trying to achieve that, and you know that eventually they're going to get together as a couple. I also found out somehow, somewhere, that this is an ℍ𝕆𝔻𝕻. I don't know how that is going to happen. There is nothing that hints at that being the case in the story just yet, so I'm curious to see how that happens in the future. But it is a very, very simple plot. The only other thing that made the plot interesting was the system, and we use interaction with the systems, the way the quest was set up, the reward system. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the intrigue. I think it's the intrigue category that I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, the plot was simple, but again, this is a simple, or a simplicity that was well executed. So I'm not exactly unsatisfied with it. I do not have a problem with the way it was done. Not every story has to be mind-blowingly well done. Simplicity can be well executed and still be satisfying, and that's how I'm going to describe this story. So for the plot, I'm going to give that 8 points. The next category is intrigue. I already talked about this a little bit in the last category. The most intriguing aspect of this story is seeing how Liu, the pet fish, is going to get to the point of being able to save the tyrant from the fate of becoming a tyrant, and seeing how that is going to happen, how the main story that he read is going to deviate from the story that we're now reading. So the changes from the original story that he read, and how he's going to change the story so that the prince doesn't become a tyrant. I'm intrigued to see how that's going to happen. And another intriguing aspect of the story is the fact that he now has an ability sometimes to transform into a human being, and there are situations where he has to avoid being get caught. Because without fail, almost every time, I think every single time he transformed into a human being in this book, there was a situation where he nearly got caught. So those were very fun parts of the book to read, and just seeing how he tried to wiggle his way out of avoiding suspicion of the fact that he was the pet fish and had the ability to transform into a human being. Now that I've said that, another thing that I realized I'm intrigued about was that even though Prince Jing figured out that his pet fish had the ability to transform into a human being, he hasn't confronted Liu about it in this first book. He's just kind of keeping it to himself in hopes that Liu is going to tell him by himself that he is his pet fish. So I'm intrigued about that part, why he decided to do that, and how they're both going to eventually realize that the other person knows their secret. So how Liu is going to find out that the prince knows his secret and eventually gets to the point where he confronts the prince about it. Or maybe it's going to be the other way around. Maybe he's just going to open up to the prince and the prince is going to tell him that he already knew that. Or maybe he's not. So I find, however that is going to play out, that is going to be another intriguing aspect of the story. The next letter is going to be logic. Oops, I forgot to mention what my rating for the intrigue category is. I'm going to rate that category 8 points. And now the next category is logic. So logic-wise, I think the story is already not something that you're meant to take too serious. There isn't a whole lot of logic in that plot right from the jump. So if you're trying to be too logical in how you enjoy reading this, I think you've already failed right from the start. Just keep an open mind with the logical aspect of it. But I would say that the story didn't have a whole lot of plot holes, although I did have quite the number of questions. They didn't necessarily detract from how much I enjoyed reading the story, but there are questions regardless. The very first one being how Liu was transmigrated into this world. The story doesn't really give you much explanation around that portion of the story, although it does mention in the book why he was transmigrated and what his purpose is meant to be in the story. So the system tells him, you've already transmigrated, so you might as well accept your fate. The purpose of your existence is to help improve the tyrannical male lead's personality. Apparently, having a pet can help cultivate one's I'm gonna read that again. You've already transmigrated, so you might as well accept your fate. The purpose of your existence is to help improve the tyrannical male lead's personality. Apparently, having a pet can help cultivate one's tender, caring side. And you notice that the system said a pet. And I have a note there. You said a pet. Why did you make him a fucking fish? Because the fact that he's a fish poses a problem. It's hard for him to communicate with his owner. And his owner is a mute person. So you already have communication problems between the both of them. Because one person is an animal and the other one is mute. Why did the system decide to do that? The other question I had about the transmigration aspect of this story, it just tells you that, okay, you're transmigrated and this is the purpose for the story. But why Liu specifically? The story doesn't mention how he was the one that was chosen to be transmigrated. And if you can assume that he's not the only one that was reading this story in his original world, because it doesn't mention that he was the only one reading it, that means there were other readers. So out of all the other readers, why was Liu the one that was chosen? I hope they're going to explain that sometime in the future, otherwise it's gonna drive me crazy. I'm not just going to accept the fact that this man was randomly chosen, because it just means it could have literally been anyone else. Why was it him specifically? I want an answer to that question. The other thing that I was wondering about was that this system And stories like this, systems like this are meant to be trying to help this main character that was transmigrated to prevent the terrible events that's going to occur in the future from happening. So they're meant to be working hand in hand with the main character to make sure that they pass their quest. But that seems to be the opposite situation in this novel. The system was almost purposefully being vague and being difficult and making the quest increasingly difficult for 𝕍𝕬 to navigate. And I cannot figure out or understand why that would be the case. It's almost like he's making the quests much harder than they need to be purposefully. And I need an explanation for that. I hope that is something that's going to be explained in the future. Again, otherwise it's going to drive me crazy. So I hope there is an explanation for that in the future. So those were the logic or the questions that had to do with logic that I had regarding the way the story was written. And for that reason, this was the category that I rated lowest in all of the categories. I rated this category 7 points because although I enjoyed the story as a whole, and like I said, it doesn't have plot holes, although I have questions that didn't necessarily detract from how much I enjoyed this volume, there are still questions that I want to be answered regardless. So 7 points for this category. Now for the very last category, I thought I would never get there. Oh my god, I cannot believe how much I have to say about things sometimes. But enjoyment is another category that I'm going to give a full 10 points, probably because I went into this with little to no expectations. I was very surprised by how well I enjoyed it. And in terms of enjoyment, I have no negative thing to say about it. It was a full 10 points. Capiche? Like, I have nothing more to say. I just really enjoyed it. It was 10 points. And I've just realized that I did not add up the points from all the categories, so I'm going to do that on screen right now. I have 1-8 for characters. The next category was atmosphere. I had 9 points, so that's 17. The next one was writing, 10, 27. Then plot 8, that's 35. Another 8, 43. Logic, oops. Everything is all over the place. Darn it. Okay, logic was 7. I forgot where I left it. You know what? I'm just gonna go off screen and calculate it and come back to you. Okay, so I had 3 8s, 2 10s, 1 7, and 1 9. So 3 8s, 24, 2 10s, 20, 24 plus 20, 44. 1 9 will be 44 plus 9. 53, and then 1 7. That is a total of 60 points across 7 categories. And if I calculate the average of that over 7 categories, I think it was a little bit over 8.5, so approximately about 8.6, and that lands me in the 4.5 to 5 category. So I'm just going to give this 4.75, which is not too far off from my original rating without doing a more in-depth review of the series. So that just means that I was still pretty close. I still really enjoyed this novel. I would like to hear your opinions of it, if you've read this novel, or if this video convinced you to read it, or if you just want to talk more about what you enjoyed reading about the series. Whatever day you find yourself watching this, make it a great one, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.